So
Hello.
welcome to the Synaptic Forum at SaiU University. Synaptic Forum is a series of online discussions with visionary thinkers around the world. We live in a time of unprecedented global challenge, but also, in my opinion, in a time of unprecedented opportunity. The opportunity being, as an educator, I would have to say, driven by our expansion of knowledge, of understanding, and of education around the world. The future of India and of the world belongs to our youth. And so it's our job as the leaders of educational institutions, faculty members around the world, practitioners, leaders in all walks of life to make sure that our youth receive the kind of education that will prepare them to step into positions of leadership where they are responsible, thoughtful leaders and global citizens. Everything today occurs on a global stage. Whether you want to go into international business or into government or non governmental organizations, other kinds of activities, it's global. At SaiU University, education is driven by sparking new connections in the minds of students through active learning inspired by people at the frontiers of knowledge and action. My name is Jamshed Bharucha, and I have the honor of being the founding vice chancellor of SaiU University, a new world class university being launched in Chennai. My guest today is Sherman Teichman, who has had a distinguished career preparing students to be global leaders and global citizens. As the founding director of the Institute for Global Leadership at Tufts, he has inspired generations of students to tackle global problems characterized by conflict and complexity. I had the good fortune to work with him when I was provost at Tufts, and I got to see firsthand the unique model of international education that he has designed and implemented successfully. It's not just the traditional classroom reading from textbooks, hearing from your professor, although that, of course, is an important ingredient of education. He has been able to get students involved in experiential learning on the international front. Typically, when we think of international programs at universities, we think of semester abroad. And at SaiU University, we certainly will do lots of that. But Sherman Teichman's model of international education is one that puts students actually in the midst of global issues where they can see it, feel it viscerally, and bring important actors and leaders and participants from conflict areas around the world to campus so that students, even undergraduates, can interact with them one on one. That has a searing impact on any young person who is interested in a life that's bigger than himself or herself. Sherman Teichman uh, has been a senior fellow at the Carr Center at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He is on many important boards, including the Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, the Human Rights Foundation, Refugee Point, Combatants for Peace. Of course, most of his career was spent at Tufts University, where he created and directed the Institute for Global Leadership and taught a course that brought students into the fray, really, with actors and leaders and practitioners from around the world, and that enabled them to work on projects in different parts of the world. We are delighted that he will be joining us at SaiU University as a professor of the practice in international relations. As part of that, he'll be teaching a course on international relations. And knowing Sherman, I can assure Sci students who take that course that they will be brought into contact with important leaders around the world involved in extremely important issues ranging from civil war to human rights to the environment. Today, he will talk about the work he and his students have done in conflict zones around the world and his model of experiential education designed to inspire students to become leaders on global issues. Welcome, Sherman Teichman. I am joined by just a minute, Sherman, by Professor Anant Padmanabhan, who is our dean at SaiU University. He's the dean of academic affairs. He's the dean of law, and he's the dean of the Daksha Fellowship, whose students are represented, students and faculty on this call. Thank you, Sherman. Our, would you please mute anybody who's on this call? I'll start by asking Mr. Teichman to talk about a set of projects that I witnessed firsthand involving the conflict in South Africa when it was an apartheid state, and then involving the civil war in Iraq following the removal of Saddam Hussein. Sherman Teichman partnered with others. He'll talk about some of those partners to get people and students involved in observing and studying these conflicts up close, as well as attempts to negotiate. Welcome, Sherman. The floor is yours.
Good morning. I'm privileged to be here, privileged to be reunited with you, Jamshed. We spent a decade and more interacting with each other over very sensitive issues, and the admiration you have for teaching and for complexity is critical to what we're bringing to SAI, and I'm honored to be here. The precursor to all of this that I think you're mentioning, Jamshed, is a very complicated international track to diplomatic initiative that we carried out, bringing together remarkable figures from Mandela to Martti Ahtisaari, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, who was the former president of Finland, a cross-sector of people across the entire world to think about issues of divided societies and how to heal, how to reconcile, and how to, at the same time, do it in a manner that respected people's dignity, but also to adhere to human rights sensibilities and also to be very realistic about security concerns. The initiative that you and I, Jamshed, I think are referring to has to do with an effort that was culminated in something called the Helsinki Principles after the capital, where we negotiated for 3 years covertly. That brought together all sectors of the Iraqi society, from the Sadrists to all of the Sunni and Shia components of that society, that leadership, the tribal chiefs, in an effort to create a non-sectarian basis for election in the aftermath of the deposing of Saddam Hussein. That is the culminating moment. Maliki, the president of Iraq, was a tremendous disruptor, and it was a very chaotic time in the aftermath of the U.S. and Allied invasion of Iraq to depose one of the most ruthless dictators of our 20th and 21st century, Saddam Hussein. The way that we were able to operate has a deep history, but it was predicated on the vision of a man whose biography is The Peacemaker. This is Padraig O'Malley, an Irish professor and friend of mine for 4 decades. It begins with the apartheid era, as you're indicating. When I first began the work that you discussed a bit at Tufts in 1985, I convened a year-long forum, as I did for 30 subsequent years, on a different theme. The first year in 85, 86 was international terrorism at the time of the seizure of the American embassy in Iran and the beginning of hijackings by Hezbollah and the PLO, and a notorious one, Trans World Airlines airliner that was seized and taken to the bidonville of Beirut. In that year, I brought Padraig, who is an expert on the IRA, to our forum, organized by our students. And at that forum where we were discussing international terrorism, Olof Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden, was assassinated. And Padraig subsequently took my student chairman with him to Northern Ireland to research what was called his book, which he entitled Biting at the Grave. It was on the struggle of the IRA prisoners on hunger strikes to try to get their political rights acknowledged by the British government.
Excuse me, Sherman, you might introduce who Padraig is.
Padraig O'Malley is a professor at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, a very close friend. He is the Peacemaker. The biography of his is well articulated in the wonderful film. Padraig was my ally in what I'm going to describe over the decades that enabled us to do what we did. He brought together all the leaders of the Irish Republican Army and of the Unionists, Ian Paisley, Gerry Adams, Martin McGuinness, to attempt to reconcile them in what became the Good Friday Agreement. He was very involved in that effort to break down the struggle between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. He brought these leaders together to South Africa to witness what had happened in terms of reconciliation there with the release of Mandela and the unity that the ANC had with the apartheid Boer regime.
The ANC being the African National Congress.
The African National Congress,
Party.
led by Mandela and two remarkable South African citizens of Indian descent, Mac Maharaj and Ismail Abu Bakr. These were the leaders of the armed resistance of the effort against the apartheid regime and the senior political advisor to Mandela. Mac was the most tortured man in South Africa, shared 12 years of Mandela's 27 years in prison, smuggled out Mandela's...
Mac Maharaj, South African of Indian origin. Yeah.
Yep. I'm reaching here for a remarkable book, which I will give citation to, so your students and others can understand what this is about. This is by Padraig. The author of Biting at the Grave that I've described on the Irish hunger strikers called Shades of Difference. It's on Mac Maharaj and the struggle for South Africa. The foreword is by Nelson Mandela. Mandela met with the people who were on both sides of the Irish struggle, with Mac Maharaj and others, and in particularly Rolf Meyer. These are people that Jamshed, you met when we brought them ultimately to Tufts, to teach the Irish how they had managed in the most bitter anti-apartheid struggle to emerge from the armed struggle into political negotiations and reconciliation. And Rolf Meyer, who was the Minister of Police under the apartheid regime, was so instrumental in his dynamic change of mind that he was the person who was taking Mandela out of prison over the years to negotiate with all sectors of the South African society, because Mandela just didn't walk out of prison one day. There was a huge internal negotiation. Rolf, who is a Boer, member of the Minister of Police, was taken on as Minister of Constitution and Justice in the post-apartheid government by Mandela. Rolf became a close friend of ours. Rolf and Mac, on both sides of this bitter conflict, had managed to figure out how to move forward, and they negotiated with all the sides of the Unionists and the IRA to tell them how they had sought amnesty, how they had changed from an armed struggle to a political party, when they sought amnesty, when to give up their arms. It was quite a negotiation that Porrig had initiated and successfully created.
If I could interrupt for a minute, I'm going to occasionally interrupt just to explain a few more things. We have students on this call. The Sherman mentioned Rolf Meyer, former chief of police in the apartheid government. Okay, so he was enforcing the brutal regime, and he had a change of heart, and a lesson really in enlightened leadership is that Nelson Mandela, after he was released from prison after 27 years and became president of the new integrated South Africa, appointed this same man as his Minister of Justice. An extraordinary gesture. He could have had him locked up. That's one of the lessons here. Go ahead, Sherman.
Yeah. In all the years that I've been involved in Track 2 diplomacy and with our students, we have had to deal with the whole concept of dirty hands, accountability, responsibility. We're facing that right now with our President Trump. It is a complicated issue, and we dealt with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issues over the years. This is diplomacy, and international relations is unbelievably complex. The vision that we have is how to ultimately bring together a better future for people. Recrimination and accountability are tremendously important concepts. Retributive justice. These are struggles that are Manichaean, stark, but require great leadership. And Mandela came out after 27 years of prison, many of them in isolation, to be a leader revered by the world because of his ability somehow to transcend what everyone would understand as massive bitterness, to be able to figure out a vision that was Gandhian, that was transcendent. Not an easy feat. I've been honored to know these kinds of people. And these are things I wish to impart to your students. This is not going to be an easy way forward. In any case, Rolf and Mac were people that were able to make an impact on all of the warring sides of the Iraq situation. So we're fast forwarding from 1985, When my students were dealing with international terrorism, when I meet Porrig takes my students to Northern Ireland to interview the families of the hunger strikers. It's the first experiential, immersive educational opportunity that Jamshed is speaking to. But on the other end, suddenly, decades later, our students are observing the negotiations that are taking place between the IRA, veterans, who are now in government, Martin McGuinness and Jerry Adams, Ian Paisley's people, in a reconciliation government. They're witnessing the South Africans who had managed to transcend the war of apartheid, think with the leadership of Iraq, and all of the warring and fighting parties about how to reconcile themselves to move forward, which they did. So this is the story that Jamshed witnessed because we brought all these people together with a project called the Project on Justice in Times of Transition, which we hosted at our institute for 6 or 7 years. It's now called Beyond Conflict, and you will have access to many of these individuals, your students. We'll try to bring people to lecture at SAI and to Zoom with us in this remote time. To understand how things move forward. So it's a complicated story. It's a story of morality and immorality. It's a story of transcendence. It's a story of overcoming bitterness. It's a story of vision. And it's a story of tremendous complexity. And the ability to embrace that complexity is what is critical to what I have been trying to do for decades, and that Jamshed and I appreciated in what we could do together. And so it's a tremendous reunion to be here to think about how to move forward in this context. We are well
Sherman,
aware.
in Helsinki, the warring factions from Iraq were brought to sit around a table for several days and try and talk things out. Many of them were armed groups. And the Parag O'Malley at University of Massachusetts, who is your colleague, brought in two mediators, one who had been with Mandela in the apartheid struggle, Cyril Ramaphosa, who is now the new president of South Africa, astonishingly brilliant person, and the other was one of the leaders of the IRA. And so you had this remarkable situation where a freedom fighter from South Africa and a freedom fighter from Northern Ireland were moderating a very tense discussion among the warring factions in Iraq. And it's just remarkable what human beings are capable of. Just wanted to make that point, Sharon.
Absolutely. And Martyar Tassari, who goes on to win the Nobel Prize for Peace, was our convener. And why are Jamshed and I bringing this forward is because our students, you guys, into the future, had a partnership in this, had involvement in this. We're doing the precursor research for this. We're involved in the logistics. We're involved in transcribing, witnessing, and learning. I am the son of a father whose family was wiped out in the Holocaust, except for himself and two of his sisters who managed to emigrate to Israel after the Anschluss in Austria. I grew up tremendously conflicted and angry and interested in retribution. We had the Nuremberg trials. Retributive justice is critical to have accountability, but the question is balance and integrity with your humanity. It's a complicated world, and the question is how not to face the dilemma of, in political science terms, it would be called subordination and superordination. For me, it's the victim and the victimizer. How do you stop the vicious cycle of the victims once they are free to extort their own form of retribution, which ends in just this gyra of recrimination and hatred and ongoing conflict. It's one of the most difficult things to do. And it involves compromise, it involves a tremendous forbearance and restraint, and at the same time, figuring out how to be accountable and how to make sure that people are held to the highest of standards. In South Africa, we had our students involved in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They studied with Pumla Gadabo Marisikela, who is a remarkable psychologist who was in charge for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of bringing together the witnesses, but also reconciling the families of the killers and the killed, really complex psychological issues. But these are the issues that are important and to understand and comprehend and to witness. Because it's easy to be a critic, it's easy to exact vengeance. It's perhaps emotionally satisfying immediately, but the long-term repercussions and the carrying out of hatred and vengeance is unbelievably destructive, and it goes from one generation to the next. And we, in psychological terms and in political and ethical and religious terms, have to figure out how to strike balances, uneasy balances, and how to move forward.
So, how was that managed in the South African Truth and Reconciliation? I mean, as I recall, there were families of people, blacks, who were tortured and killed by the white supremacist regime, and they had to sit there listening to the torturers and the killers confessing and then going free. How was the Mandela government able to deal with people who wanted revenge?
Well, in many cases, people were imprisoned. There were revenge killings. There was, even in the aftermath of, let us say, the liberation of France from the Nazis, there were massive numbers of reprisal killings. That is, so in these conflicts, in our experience, the spate of blood and vengeance gushes forward initially. And then people realize what they're doing, passing this baton of horror from one generation to the next. In the context of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we dealt with Desmond Tutu, the cleric, you need certain qualities of faith. You need certain qualities of pragmatism. It's the work of Pumla is work that I will expose to your students. It's unbelievably difficult. I mean, for people who do not try to reconcile, they are the people who are ultimately imprisoned and kept from society, the people who want to continue the viciousness. Look, from my point of view, personally, only the victim can give amnesty to the killer. No one else can do that. Only the person whose family, who had, the person's most intimate to this horrifying situation of violence and counter-violence. These are the only people who can staunch things. It's the most difficult thing I've ever witnessed. How is it done? I mean, we managed, Jamshed and you, who were so instrumental in allowing this to happen. We brought to our campus Henty Botha, one of the heads of the apartheid death squads, a torturer, to sit with Mac Maharaj in front of our students and to think with them. And they needed to come out of South Africa to Medford, Massachusetts, where Tufts is located, to be able to have the conversation and the encounter they needed to have with one another to ultimately drop the sword. And we have a program which you seem to be interested in, Jamshed, for SaiU, called Allies, Alliance Linking Leaders in Education and the Services, where our students, liberal arts students, work with the cadets and midshipmen of our military academies to try to learn each other's culture and to build bonds of friendship. When crisis hits, they have the respect for each other and to work together. At 2 a.m, Henty Botha and Mac Maharaj met with the cadets and midshipmen and talked about the question of torture. And Mac broke down in tears when he talked about the fact how the ANC, were involved in torture because they had been infiltrated, and they tortured the people who were being informers to try to figure out how to move forward in their armed struggle against the horrifying apartheid regime. And Henty was there as well. It was a crisis of I've never seen the like of, in the sense that Mac and Henty wanted to tell the students who were at that point we were facing at that point Guantanamo and the tortures of Abu Ghraib, etc., how to try to break out of this cycle, acknowledging what had happened, holding people to account, imprisoning people, but not continuing the torture, not continuing the stain on our humanity, which, if we perpetuated it, was just going to lead future generations down the path of vengeance and ongoing conflict that would never be an end.
Sherman, you
Yeah.
told me once Mac Maharaj was the most tortured man in South Africa.
In South Africa. Mandela's wrote this introduction to Porig's book, the autobiography of Mac Maharaj. Yes, Mac was the head of the political arm of the ANC, and he was imprisoned, and meeting him was stunning. Meeting his daughter, who we brought to Fletcher to do her graduate degree, was a culminating moment to try to help generations move forward. I myself am an external person to all of this. I'm an educator. I'm trying to bring people together to witness the people who are firsthand in all of these conflicts. I have no privilege or no right or self-righteousness to be involved in this in any judgmental way. I'm a convener, attempting to try, as Porig did, to be a peacemaker, trying to figure out a way to move forward. But only the people who are the victims of these situations, the killers who themselves are victims, the people who have been tortured and killed and who kill and torture in return, these are the people who have to come to the recognition and the reconciliation that happens, even though it seems so absolutely remote and impossible. Because
Sherman, you said the killers themselves are victims.
Yes. This is something. Pumla wrote a book on a man named de Kock, one of the most brutal of the killers. It was a book that called "A Man Died That Day," became a very important play as well. And I can send on this stuff so you can witness it in all its complexity. People, and we've known, people who were abused as children, abused through their lives. People are not born as natural killers, but people are put into circumstances that are, as we have recognized what psychology is all about and neuroscience is all about, how people are acted upon to end up in these circumstances. And the question is how to break the reality that people can be rehabilitated. This goes to the work that we do as well at my institute, or did as well, on the death penalty, on the revocation of the death penalty, trying to figure out how to rehabilitate, trying to figure out how to turn people's lives around without the continuity of vengeance, which is such a primal part of our lizard's brain. So yes, killers themselves have been their humanity has been killed and staunched before they become killers in so many instances.
At this point, I'd like to ask Dean Anant Padmanabhan if he'd like to follow up with any connections there might be between international conflict resolution and some of the work that Anant and his faculty are doing with the Daksha Fellowship on dispute resolution. Anant?
Thanks, Jamshed. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Thanks, Sherman, for taking time out for this conversation. I'm just listening to you. It's almost like I'm placed in a setting that I have only probably read in the newspapers when growing up as a kid. And for many of our Daksha fellows here, I don't think many of them were even born when these important historical events were unfurling. I found particularly interesting the fact that a lot of this attempt at reconciliation is built around narrative, right? I mean, people speaking out what they had experienced and the evocative power of that narrative. And when you tell that story, even those who are ideologically opposed, may have very different views on these issues. I mean, it just seems to completely sway the way they, perceived or had learned to perceive these issues, right? And I just wanted to hear how the power of narrative was really deployed in these settings. I had seen some of the work that you had done, and which we will take up as a follow-up. But I just really wanted to hear your thoughts on the use of narrative as a tool.
It's critical. Part of the reason I'm attracted to Sai is the way you've begun to describe what you want to do. And this is very complicated. Stories, humanity, firsthand accounts, the integrity of those accounts have the power to break through because the necessity is to get to a point of from passion to compassion. It's born on the autobiography of people's lives and derives from that. How can I begin to describe this? I believe in the power of storytelling and narratives. I believe in the power of witness. I believe in the power of the arts. And in this particular situation, I belong to a remarkable coterie of extraordinary photojournalists who have photographed conflict, post-conflict, environmental degradation, all kinds of important international events all over the world. We have just published a book, the Seven Foundation, this is Roman numeral 7, called Imagine, Reflections on Peace, in which we have sent back the extraordinary photographers who photographed during the extraordinary conflicts of Bosnia, of Northern Ireland, of Myanmar, of Cambodia, of Rwanda, of Colombia. We've sent back Lebanon. We've sent back the photographers in the last few years to whose work has been published in this book called Imagine, of that period, atrocities, the cover stories of our magazines that convinced the Clinton administration to intervene in Kosovo, remarkable photography. We sent them back to photograph the current situation, and we sent them back with remarkable authors and poets to understand how fragile or how consolidated peace had happened in these divided societies. And the book is, its preface is by the extraordinary head of our program on narrative documentary, Gary Knight. Its epilogue is by Samantha Power, the former UN ambassador of the Obama administration. It's remarkable for me because one of my former students, Elizabeth Herman, who actually photographed as a student in Ajmer on one of our projects in India, wrote the chapter on reconciliation with Porg. Porg has written the chapter in great detail that I've sent on to you about the negotiations I mentioned and the stories that he told that brought together Cyril Ramaphosa and Ian Paisley and Mac Mirage. It's a book which I'm going to heartily recommend our students read. And it's a story of how reconciliation happened and how peace is fragile and what is happening in all of these divided societies. These are all stories. They're done photographically, they're done with interviews, they're done with poetry, they're done with firsthand recollections. And the people who are interviewed are from all different sides of these conflicts in Lebanon, in Rwanda, etc. In all of these countries, peace has come, even though it's extraordinarily fragile, and the warlords in Lebanon are still remarkably powerful. There's the dilemma of autocracy in Rwanda, which may or may not be a powerful, important thing, what is happening with their presidency, and what is where the word Tutsi and Hutu are forbidden. We have learned in the former Yugoslavia and Kosovo what happens when you repress these things. Tito, the leader of the former Yugoslavia, tamped down all the passions of religion and sectarianism. And when he died, the former Yugoslavia, in the middle of Europe, Sarajevo, that had just hosted the Winter Olympics, exploded, families against families. The massacre of Srebrenica, the first time genocide again came to Europe. Because of the repression of feelings and passions, the inability to really solve what needed to be solved. And we'll talk later about science and stories in psychology that was very involved in Kosovo and the work that our students did with practitioners, statisticians, scientists, and beyond conflict, the group I mentioned, the Project on Justice in Times of Transition, is now deeply looking at neuroscience and conflict, because we're running out of answers. Because as a species, in terms of humanity, we keep on doing these things. We have cessation, we secede, and here in the United States, we're witnessing the renewal of the Civil War, the most horrifying conflict on our own continent, our own country. Because we never managed to figure out how to heal our racial divide and the hatred and supremacy that is poisoned and diseased our countries. This does not go away. This takes incredible storytelling. It takes incredible narratives that we're trying to deal with on every kind of level. One of the most popular rock and roll anthems, The Night They Took Dixie Down, is being studied at this point because the Confederacy flag finally first showed up in our U.S. Capitol, one of the symbols of the Confederacy and of white supremacy. It had never been in the Capitol until this moment. This is a universal problem, and the way we try to deal with it is with compassion, with humanity. And so this book piece is a compendium that looks back at the decades of the wars that and the conflicts that I've mentioned: Lebanon, Rwanda, Northern Ireland, etc., throughout all the continents of our globe, to figure out how we have struggled and continue to struggle to try to bring peace to our arena.
Sherman, as you know, dispute resolution is one of the themes of the Daksha Fellowship, and our dean Anant is, certainly looking to have us make a mark nationally as a place where lawyers can come to learn about dispute resolution. You've talked about resolution of international disputes, conflicts. Do you, and this is also a question for Anant, feel free, see parallels between the methodologies, the approaches to resolving international disputes versus resolving the kinds of disputes that lawyers might be brought into, that our students are being trained for? Anant, do you want to lead off with some ideas and then?
तेरे पास डेटा है क्या? वाईफाई पे कॉल करना.
Neha, you're not on mute.
So Sherman, I had a similar point there, which is, when you bring about the point about narrative, right? I mean, and especially what struck me was the fact that you are, in some sense, through the power of narrative, creating this platform, right, where individuals can vent out a lot of suppressed emotion, and be it the international dispute resolution system, and even more strikingly, or the dispute resolution system that we have domestically. one big critique has often been that it is a very depersonalized system, right? The skills that we teach our students to what makes you a good lawyer, right? In the professional definition of that term, and even the way you are supposed to judge a case, right? Dispassionately, using these rules and principles and common law and all of that, right? And this, you've seen the U.S. Supreme Court or any other courts in the United States, and similarly the Indian Supreme Court and the high courts here. And my question really was, I mean, taking off from what Jamshed was asking, right? Are there parallels that we can take from your experience working in the international reconciliation space on how you make these institutions and systems a lot more compassionate, right, while at the same time retaining what you may call the rigor of the professional discipline?
It's a critical question that has to be reconciled. I mean, the vision of objectivity, or the asymptotic approach to be objective, has been debunked by people that range from the linguist Noam Chomsky, who's been involved with us, to a whole range of people that have talked about subjectivity and objectivity and how to strike these balances. And the whole question of the rule of law to be an adjudicator. From my point of view, I will look to and do look to the justices who have been the paragons of being able to do this in their ways in which they judge. So I will bring it immediately to a friend, Richard Goldstone, who was a judge in the chief judge of the Supreme Court of South Africa, and how he helped to undermine this unjust system. Here I'm reading from a book by a friend of mine, Dan Terrace, who we helped create a project, the Justice and Judges Practice at Brandeis University, named after Justice Brandeis, one of our more compassionate and brilliant justices in the United States Supreme Court. Richard Goldstone was involved in the resurrection of the judicial system. He worked with an incredible justice named Albie Sachs, who wrote the book, The Soft Vengeance of a Freedom Fighter. He had been blown up by the Boer apartheid secret police in I believe it was in Zambia, where he was in exile. Lost his arm. There are so many examples of judges who have figured out how to do this. And Justice Goldstone is somebody who did the Goldstone Commission that looked at the violence in Gaza, in one of the most painful cases for me as the son of a father of Holocaust background, to realize what has happened in Israel in terms of that conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, and its own apartheid and its own just horrifying circumstances. Dan was the head of this particular project. He's now the dean of faculty at Al-Quds University on the West Bank. He's written the book on the trials of Richard Goldstone, which I'm going to recommend. It's on the back of it. Kofi Annan writes positively about this. Michael Ignatieff, who is an extraordinary politician, who's now the head of the Central European University, working on these issues of reconciliation. How do you do this? You judge with compassion. You balance, the authority of law with justice. You struggle with, and it's an ongoing struggle. I mean, to judge, to take a person's life, in terms of sentencing somebody to death. I mean, it just takes a certain humility, which we don't have at this point. Our Trump administration, after 17 years, has just re-brought back after 17 years the federal death penalty, and are rushing to put people to death before Biden can come in. That will be reversed because of the kinds of people that we will put in, and hopefully, even despite what our Supreme Court looks like, bring back the balance between the authority of law and the necessity to be accountable and to judge with compassion, with insight, with the tools of psychology, with the tools that are enhanced by everything you're talking about, which is to reach the human ethos, the human soul, the ability to, through story, to comprehend. So, there is something in my mind, it's always the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. And so that continuum, and how is it in every individual case different? Because there is no standard one uniform rule. And it's a question how people interpret, and we're facing it in our own country on how to interpret the Constitution. Right. And there is staggering revelation today about a man named Hawley, who is the person who's in controversy at this point, refusing to accept the election of Biden, and his background in a remarkable clerical antecedent history of religion and Opus Dei. I mean, there is history and philosophy and psychology and neuroscience and all these tools, in which I understand SaiU wants to integrate, because you are going to be a remarkable interdisciplinary educational venture, which Jamshed is uniquely qualified to lead, is what's necessary. There isn't one size fits all.
I'll let Jamshed speak more about the way that we are thinking about these tools. I had just one final question, which is that I did see that some of this work is now going into policy framing as well, right? And apart from individualized cases, and I saw the work that you're doing in Syria, right, where you're using it as part of randomized controlled trials. And RCTs are famous or infamous for the insights that they can provide, incorrectly or otherwise, on policy framing. So I found that quite interesting, because at one level you're talking about data science and those insights, and at the other you're talking about individualized stories and narratives, right? How do these two worlds really meet?
Well, they meet in the story of Patrick Ball. I back to individuals, because the only way I can really understand life is through the life that people lead, and the exemplars that they present, and the manner in which we can figure out how to make people icons or people to realize we never want to be. So how to do this? Well, first of all, in disputes, to try to bring data science and the tools of statistics and analysis to try to figure out how to be how to aspire to truth. Truth is one of the most elusive concepts in the world. There are facts, there are truths, there's wisdom, there's intelligence. You have to combine all of this together forward. I am, I always tell my students that they need to understand the history of Wannsee. Wannsee is the villa where the Nazis gave the final solution. Eichmann, Heydrich, they met in this magnificent villa in the outskirts of Berlin, and they created the dictum that was going to create the destruction of European, and if they could have, world Jewry. They were postdocs, they were lawyers, they were highly educated people, but they had no ethical sensibility. Education without ethics is useless, and science without compassion is useless, and faith without evidence is useless from my point of view. I'm doing this as a prelude to think about a couple of case studies that you are just that I can bring to bear to, I hope, explicate this. How does this work as an instance? So Patrick Ball is a statistician of a unique kind. He worked with the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. This is someone I can bring to SaiU. His teaching and methodology, my students worked with him in the former Yugoslavia. If I can talk to that story and then talk to one other story that are exemplary in terms of human rights and science. It's maybe very satisfying, and a lot of our students, went to the School of the Americas, where the Americans were training a lot of the officers of the military in Chile during the Dirty War, in Argentina, in Nicaragua, etc., the Contra Wars. I mean, we're training military officers of authoritarian dictatorial regimes who were killers. It was the School of the Americas was a place where a lot of these South American officers were coming to get the advanced skills of torture. And so students, would try to protest as the way they protested, and we often see protests against apartheid or against anything, placards and yelling. To me, this is fruitless. And what I try to teach is how to leverage that passion and how to do it with evidence that judges are going to need, the lawyers are going to need to be able to make the kinds of decisions we would hope for. So let me give a couple of examples here. My students went to The Hague to witness the efforts that were successful ultimately to make rape a crime of war. All right. And I know rape is endemic in so many societies, including India, including the United States. It's a massive crime of war. And indeed, one of my students is in charge of the Physicians for Human Rights element that does the investigations on rape survivors and trying to bring their rapists to account. That's a very unbelievable personal type of violence and degradation. And how does one deal with that? In this case, my students went to The Hague to witness the trial because one of the tools of war that had been used by the Serbs against the Bosniaks, the Muslims of Sarajevo and of Bosnia, and also rape camps, Marska, etc. Just horrifying. And this is, just a few decades ago. This is not the barbaric Middle Ages or what have you. They went to see the hearings, and rape was finally, after all these generations, made a crime of war for which people can be really incarcerated in prison for life, in certain societies, death penalty. And then they went back into the conflict zones, to Croatia, to the Republika Srpska, which was the Serb-Bosnian enclave, to Bosnia itself, to Serbia. And they spent an entire year interviewing the women who were victims, the judges and barristers in many instances, because the rapes took place of women who were of tremendous stature, as a horrifying way to try to demoralize people. And they took the findings and they realized that the way in which the narrative that you've talked about, the story that was being brought back to this conflict zone by the Serbs, by the Bosniaks, by the Croatians, was so biased, so subjective, that each side was able to assert that they were the victims, whereas this was intercommunal and victims throughout the whole society. And they worked with Patrick to do the work to make sure their findings after a year, which were presented at the Department of Criminology in Sarajevo, University of Sarajevo, where Justice Goldstone was, where Gabriel Kirk MacDonald went and became the model for the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in Liberia and Sierra Leone after those wars, where our two young students, they were 19 and 20, two women, Tammy and Kristen, had to make sure that their compilation of the 54 NGOs they worked with and the women and their interviews were not considered to be skewed, but had the credibility of the kind of objectivity that was necessary. They worked with Patrick. Patrick said, no, these young women, they can't, my graduate students can't do the Bayesian statistical analysis. He basically taught these young women, who went on now to finish their PhDs with him at the University of Michigan and elsewhere, to figure out how to do this work. I'm going to go back to my narrative of the soldiers and in the War of the Americas. So holding placards and protesting got us nowhere. What happened was that Patrick with students went in and took a look at the atrocities that were committed in each one of these sectors of Guatemala in a particular situation. To prove the incidents, the highest incidents of atrocities were under the officers who had been trained very deliberately. And he made the association between the indexes of instances and did this statistically, created the data, and that allowed for isolating the very officers who needed to be most isolated and taken from their command and imprisoned. He did this in Kosovo with our students, where the debate was, why were the Albanian Muslims fleeing Kosovo? Was it because of Serb ethnic cleansing? Was it because of NATO bombing? Or was it because of the Kosovo Liberation Army's atrocities? And they went to checkpoints over a number of years and months to take a look at where the families were coming from. They interviewed them. They figured out individual stories. They aggregated them. They subjected them to analysis. They did this sophisticated work on human rights data analysis. And it became incontrovertible that it was the Serb bombing, the ethnic cleansing, with other kinds of atrocities as well. These are anecdotal stories that I'm telling you right now, but I will provide your students, and I provided you guys with the links for the actual evidence and the very detailed sense of this. And I also gave you the work now of one of my former students, Mike Nikonchuk. Here's an individual who I love, who's a wonderful story. It's a story of a student. He came to me with 12 of his peers one day in my office at Tufts. This is a man whose father was Ukrainian, his mother Guatemalan. Mike shows up and he wants to take his students to create something called Build Understanding Through International Learning and Development to Guatemala, to the village of decommissioned, amnestied guerrillas, armed terrorists who had kidnapped his mother's father for ransom, successfully ransomed, and who had embittered the family. And Mike saw what was happening in his family. He determined to break the cycle. He went back and created this unbelievable initiative, which also ultimately Build India happened. The students went to Tamil Nadu, and all of this can be explained in much more detail, but I'm briefly doing this. Mike shows up, they create this project. They work with the decommissioned guerrillas on coffee farming. They get them land grants, property protection under the law, whatever. They do all kinds of things. Mike learns Arabic. He ends up in Geneva. We position him there with the people who created Davos, the Schwabs who created the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship. He realizes that in the competition for best NGO of the Middle East North Africa region is a man named Kurt Rhodes, who was the pediatrician of and the dean of the American University of Beirut, who's the people whose the mothers whose children he delivered are the victims of a heinous massacre in Lebanon, in Sabra and Shatila. He quits his job as a dean and pediatrician, begins this amazing organization called Questscope. Mike shows up to educate in the refugee camps with him of fleeing Iraqi and ultimately Syrian refugees in Jordan. He becomes an emergency response coordinator. He's not satisfied. He says this is not the answer. He gets his master's in resilience and trauma studies at King's College, I think it is. He comes back and he has created in what used to be the Project on Justice in Times of Transition that I talked about with Porig and the efforts that we made in South Africa and Iraq. It becomes Beyond Conflict, where Mike brings the major project now on neuroscience and storytelling and efforts to heal. And it's an extraordinary story, and it is extraordinarily effective. So all that information, all of this, which I'm telling briefly, and as I hear myself tell this is so many shards of information, is going to be made more comprehensible to all of your students because it's detailed and there's brief references. And as a teacher, you always try to leave behind resources for students to evaluate on their own. And that's what you will do.
Thank you, Sherman. You have provided thousands of little shards that
emotional shrapnel.
We need to bring this to a close. I hope that the students and the faculty and others watching this have gotten at least a glimpse of the extraordinary opportunity that you bring to SaiU University for our students to get involved in learning about international conflict, about the resolution of conflicts through peaceful means, about using storytelling, narrative, photojournalism, and data science to document international crimes, war crimes, and with your involvement with SAI, I'm certain that we will be the university in India where students and faculty interested in these broader issues that apply, of course, globally, but domestically as well. SAI University would be the place to study and engage and get involved in a very experiential way. So we will consider this the first of many online interactions. And after the pandemic, you'll come visit us in person. You're going to teach our course in international relations. What I'd like to do at this point, I know that there might be a few people with burning questions, but some people may need to go on to other appointments and meetings and classes. So feel free to drop off. But if anybody does have a question for Sherman Teichman, why don't you post it on chat, and I'll try to distill some of them and go from there. So we can go on for another few minutes for those who want to stay on and ask questions of Sherman Teichman.
Excited to be with you.
I think people are so overwhelmed. I don't think
they are lawyers. If you allow them to speak, I'm sure they will.
Well, Jamshed, if I could just make a comment, not a question.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Sherman. That was beyond enlightening. Thank you very much. Here in Toronto, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission closed in, I think, ended in 1995. It was essentially for the government to come to terms with the residential schools for the rehabilitation, not rehabilitation, but for the kids from Aboriginal First Nations families from the 1870s all the way up till 2000 when they finally closed. And what that did to a whole generation of children of First Nations families, where they were put in these schools and deprived of any contact with their parents and deprived of any contact with their own culture, and what damage that has done for generations and generations of First Nations people. That was what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created to answer these questions when the largest class action settlement for the residential schools was settled between the Canadian government and the families of these kids. Now, this has, of course, become an ongoing issue, and it has, of course, now incorporated into the curriculum of many of the schools so that future generations come to an understanding about what exactly happened. But this is one example of domestically what nations can need to come to terms with their own experiences, with their own people. I just thought I'd mention that because you spoke about truth and reconciliation. In the Canadian sense, it's mainly about the residential schools, but there's also a very interesting subject for study. Would you agree with that? Yeah.
Emphatically. These are, when we talk about divided countries, there's a vision not necessarily between Bangladesh and India and Pakistan, etc. We talk about divided conflicts. These are internal. When we think about the law, it's not just refugees, it's the people who are most at victim, the IDPs, the internally displaced peoples. So all of these things, and when I talked about the death penalty, this is, domestically an issue. I mean, these things, for me, The problem with me, with you, is that I see everything interrelated. And to me, I love complexity. And when I first begin to describe things, I don't think it's linear. And so you'll have to get used to me. But in the context, I will speak very deliberately to you, Nalin. I know this story very well. It turns out that one of my former students is the president of Nunavut, is the president of the Inuit, Natan Obed. He is a Tufts graduate who is remarkable. His field of expertise is suicide prevention, because these issues are so, well, just Iris. I know, but I'm on the Zoom. Okay, yeah. Sorry, my wife, who is quite a remarkable woman, who will also be an asset here. One of my closest friends, almost a soulmate, is your former Minister of Justice and your Minister, your Attorney General of the past. His name is Irwin Cutler. Do you know Irwin, or of Irwin? All right, so Cotler, Irwin Cutler. He was the Attorney General of Canada, the Minister. He is the head of the Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, the center that Jamshed mentioned at the beginning. Raoul Wallenberg being the remarkable diplomat who saved tens of thousands of Jews from the Nazi Holocaust. And so I know this. It's a brutal story. And yes, of course, internally, this is the case. And as it turns out, one of my remarkable students, Cody Valdez, is now at McGill Law School, deeply committed to the whole question of First Nations, Indigenous peoples. We have a horrific history in our own country. We're born on the roots of our own genocide here, in terms of Native peoples here. These are universal issues. I mean, you know, you have caste system in India. We have so many issues that we have to contend with. This is, to me, as Jamshed knows, the mantra of my institute was thinking beyond boundaries, acting across borders. Now the trebuchet, which is my consultancy, which my work with SaiU falls, the mantra is breaking down barriers, building bridges. To me, everything is interdisciplinary. To me, everything transcends borders. I mean, as I say, I go back to my Holocaust family's roots. And to me, the idea that because of longitude and latitude of arbitrary nations, you know, certain things were domestic matters and therefore couldn't be, you know, contradicted, whereas other things were international. We had international law led to, you know, the Holocaust led to so many other things. So to me, I see the world as Gaia. We haven't talked about the whole environmental part of this and law and stories and whatever, which is potent and so necessary. We haven't talked about water. We haven't talked about so many issues that I hope to bring into international relations. But you're quite right. I mean, what you're talking about is a really prescient and critical ongoing reality.
Sherman, as a final rounding off response, I'd like you to look at the two questions on chat, or I can read them for you. One is from Mahesh Menon, who is on our faculty. Can we have some programs for international law students on international negotiations? Yes or no?
I think that's an answer for you guys. If you do have such courses, I would know how to bring content to it and people to it.
Okay, so the answer is yes, Mahesh, thank you. The second one is from Sharad Asha Vyas about what's going on in the United States right now. I guess everybody can read it on chat. What is it, do you think, that motivates people to come together to demand change, good or bad, in the context of the insurgency at the U.S. Capitol building last week?
Well, to me, when I was asked to isolate the most critical of issues in the world, my struggle is between racism and inequality. To me, they are two of the most profoundly vexing issues that need to be addressed. Um, Inequality is staggering in our world. The kind of corrupt capitalism that we have witnessed, the K economy as we call it here, where one part of the K, the letter K, is the ascendant economy that is booming via the stock market, etc., for an unbelievable marginal number of our people. The people, I mean, the small numbers of people in the world who possess the wealth that is deprived to the billions, the bottom of the majority of the world, yes. Leads to extraordinary exploitation by cynicism and by people who are racists. That is what has happened here in this country. 1/3 of the people of Weimar Germany, when Hitler comes to power, are unemployed, and almost a 0.1% of the population are Jews. They managed to create a scapegoat of victimization, building on people's real sense of disenfranchisement and poverty and isolation and being demeaned, etc., into extraordinary manipulated circumstances. We're facing much of that here in this country. We have not resolved this in any way, shape, or form. We have to reform our police. We have to reform our intelligence. We have to reform our educational system. We have to reform. There is so much work to be done in this country. We have resources to do it. Most countries don't have the resources to do it. So we have an edge up depending on how we can contend with this. But for good or bad, as you put it, I mean, Black Lives Matter, then is an extraordinary, exemplary reality. But what they came up, that's the horrible slogan, defund the police, is just, it almost, in my mind, was created by some infiltrator to be able to create a phrase which was so destructive and so manipulated so that people didn't realize what was meant by this was to change, the responsibilities of the police that should be on the hands of people who know how to handle mental disorder and psychological problems rather than to police them. I mean, I'm getting into a tangent here, but the bottom line is inequality and racism are at the root of so much of what we're facing in our country, and I think universally. And the question is how to redress that, and that's urgent.
Sherman, may I move to another? I want to give, we have a student, a Daksha fellow, Shatakshi Shekhar, who has a question. One of the things I want us to make sure we do in any of our programs is give students a chance to interact directly with distinguished speakers. So Shatakshi, would you like to pose your question directly? Unmute yourself.
Sure, sir. Good evening. Good evening, Mr. Teichman. So my question is regarding conflict prevention. As to, with the fact that big data is evolving at a very rapid rate and it can be used for something good, what factors should be considered or looked into when we are looking at big data being used for conflict prevention? And whatever insights that we receive, how can it be used as a repository for any situation which is evolving into a conflict for future references?
It's a critical question. My answer to that is to introduce you to the people who are using this data in very positive ways. So Patrick Ball, Mike Nikonchuk, and others, the reference points that your deans and Jamshed will provide you will give the immediate answer. But as we well know, statistics can lie, they can be abused. Data, we've seen what's happening in our own country in terms of algorithms, and I can say the following. I'm going to be running a webinar very shortly, which I'm inviting all of you into. There's a magnificent book which I'm going to ask you to reference by a very close friend named Juan Enriquez. It's called Right, Wrong. And its subtitle is How Technology Influences Our Evolving Ethics. And the dialogue will be between a remarkable bioethicist, Wendell Wallach from our Yale University, and Juan. It's going to be sponsored by the Carnegie Center for Ethics and International Conflict. You're invited to this. And the best I can do is to expose you to the people who I know are doing quality things with these algorithms. Facebook, you're watching. I mean, it's exploding all around us, and if we don't solve this, we're in a huge problem. So on the one hand, there are questions of privacy, and there are questions of invasive materials. It's a critical issue. The fact that you're thinking about this is absolutely essential. And how can we do it? It has to be in applied circumstances, and the tools are there. It's a question of using them correctly and being exposed to the people who we know already, and you will, I hope, admire and critique as well. And by the way, I should be saying to all of you that I always talk to my students about being on the thin edge of skepticism without becoming cynical. So you need to listen to me and to listen to everything that people tell you. We want to turn you into, you're already critical thinkers, but we cannot avoid cynicism. So the question is, how do we embrace all this without being overwhelmed? And the only way I can say to this is to introduce you to people and to materials that you will have access to and you will work with.
Sherman, how can our students get access to the Juan Enrique webinar coming up? Just remind us the date.
We will provide, it's going to be on the 26th of January. And the best way to do this is I will send to you immediately, the links to who Juan is, and you can read some of the interviews. This is a brilliant man who is in the life sciences and the venture. I mean, he did everything from negotiate on behalf of the Mexican government with the Zapatistas to, sail the ocean with Craig Venter to map the human genome. These are, I love polymaths, people who cannot be described, but who need to be, embraced and understood. And so I will send you the link, send you biographical material. And I think the wisest thing to do is to read Right Wrong to begin with. It's a brilliant book. It's short. It's written in a really engaging, accessible manner. And it's on everything from death penalty to animal rights to, death penalty to, and technology. So it's technology and ethics. I'm seeing something here, context of Kashmir.
I feel some hesitation about introducing the the hottest, the most difficult topic in India, just at the very tail end. But I don't want to close it off. Maybe we can just have Abhishek Jain is also a faculty member in the Daksha Fellowship, phrase the question, and maybe anybody, including Sherman, have a few comments. We can do that, but clearly this would be this could be a topic for an ongoing debate and discussion on campus, where we can bring leaders involved in the conflict in to speak about it. There is a lot of fear right now, obviously, for people to talk about it or get involved in it. But I'll leave it to Abhishek to say what he wrote, and then see if Sherman, if you have any short response. Okay, Abhishek.
Yeah, good evening, sir. It was great to hear you. I'm a Daksha fellow actually right now, and so my question essentially was, Kashmir is the hotbed of conflict zones, and like having faced so much bloodshed and being at the end of radicalization and cross-border terrorism, the children have been living in a constant state of fear and security. So policy-wise, like we talked about, like you were talking about, how do you see education as a mechanism to nudge them to shaping future leaders of tomorrow? And essentially, because leaders, if they are local leaders, they are probably much closer to the solution and resolution. So how do you see education as a tool to nudge them?
Jamshed, did you set this up for me?
It was not a setup, no.
You're sure?
Abhishek, I misspoke earlier. I said he was a faculty member. I was thinking about another Abhishek who's on our faculty. This is Abhishek Jain, is a fellow in our Daksha Fellowship, and I'm glad he's had a chance to pose his question directly to you. It's not a setup question.
Well, as Jamshed knows, I believe
Can you
in
do it in less than 3 hours?
demands 3 hours. I am what's called prolix. Look that word up. Prolix, Prolix. But this is a setup question. It is not a setup question. I threw into your chat box one of the people I love most in the world is a woman named Justine Hardy. She actually spoke for me at my gala saying goodbye after 30 years. You can see what Justine has done. She has been, and now this is apparently very complicated because I think she's no longer able to function. It's become under the Modi government a very hotspot issue, yes. It always has been. I will speak very candidly about what this is about, but there is this brilliant work that Justine has done. Please look her up. This organization called Healing Kashmir, which I think goes to the heart of your question. The reason I say it's a setup, I mentioned Mike Nikonchuk, the Ukrainian, Guatemalan guy who's in the Zatari in Jordan, who's now doing neuroscience, etc. Mike worked very closely with her. I mentioned Cody Valdez, who was at McGill Law School with the first worked with her in Kashmir. We've sent a lot of our people to work with her in Kashmir to learn, to help, to deal with psychology and conflict and stories. And we sent our program on narrative documentary practice into Kashmir. Sam James, now one of the most eminent young photographers of the world, actually embedded with the Indian military in Srinagar. There's so much I could go on for hours. I won't, but this will give you a little bit of an appetite to realize that here's an answer. This is psychology, psychotherapy, mind, body, really being extraordinarily sensitive to the radicalization, etc. And we're well aware of how conflicts like this in divided societies or sovereignty issues, etc., how this plays into large politics, international relations. So when I'm with you in the context of international relations, one of the areas I work on a lot is on nuclear issues. Proliferation, working with people such as the Pakistani nuclear scientist Pervez Hoodboy, working with Rajit Singh, who was the air commodore of India years ago. We are very aware of these sensitivities and how they're brought large. We're all aware of the terrorism in Mumbai. There is so much richness, and but what I can say to you is I'm approaching my 80s. Luckily, I have 55 years of mentorship and remarkable students and folks who will hopefully provide a vision and a direction moving forward. And I can tell you there's integrity in government coming to my government. When I got on the phone call with Jamshed this morning, I said I woke up to the news that somebody who Jamshed knows, I've introduced you to Ambassador William Burns, who would have been the Secretary of State of our country most likely if Hillary Clinton had won, is now being named by Biden to head up the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. He has been for the last few years the head of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I can tell you this is a man of tremendous integrity. His biography is one of the books I will ask you to read because it talks about diplomacy and international relations. And his chief of staff, my former student, Matan Khorev, these were people deeply involved in the Iran nuclear negotiation. There's a new day coming in my country, even though we are unbelievably divided and we have our own civil war that we haven't resolved from the 1860s. We have a new day, and there's so much to be thought about. So it is absolutely correct. I look at your last sentence saying here that it's strikingly close to my approach of bringing emotion, a sense of justice, resolution, or revolution. I'll buy that. There's so much to do.
Thank you. At that point, we will close it out. Let's look at this as a beginning for our new university, SaiU University, and as an issue certainly for the Daksha Fellowship that can be followed up. These are issues that are not going to be solved in one sitting, and let's position our education as a place where people can come and learn, and then when they graduate, go out and lead. We need the leaders such as Shatachi and Abhishek and others to go out into the world and make it a better place. Thank you, Sherman Teichman, and welcome to SaiU University as our first professor of the practice. Thank you, Anand Padmanabhan, for your participation in this and your leadership in establishing the Daksha Fellowship.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Jamshed, and thanks, Sherman.
Privilege to be with you. Looking forward to this.
Absolutely. Our fellows will be in touch, and I will be in touch with you.